Welcome everyone, and it's now officially afternoon, so good afternoon to you all. I'd like to introduce our three panelists very briefly. Philip Lutgendorf teaches Hindi at the University of Iowa. He has written extensively about the Ramayana and also about Hindi cinema and the wonderful spiced tea that we all know and love, chai. Philip has now embarked upon a massive undertaking, a translation in 7 volumes of the Ramcharitmanas of the great Indian poet Tulsidas. Brian Catlos teaches in the Department of Religion at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He writes compelling books about complex relationships among Muslims, Christians, and Jews during the European Middle Ages, especially in the area of the Mediterranean. Reading them, you learn that most of what you thought you knew has misled you badly, and the light his work sheds upon those earlier times illumines as well the troubled era in which we live. Anne Carolyn Klein teaches at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Her many books include Meeting the Great Bliss Queen, Buddhist Feminist and the Art of the Self, Unbounded Wholeness, Dzogchen Pen and the Logic of the Non-Conceptual, The Heart Essence of the Vast Expanse, and Strand of Jules, a compilation of instructions on Dzogchen, the Great Completeness or Great Perfection, given by her teacher, Keizen Sambo Rinpoche. Along with Harvey Aronson, she co-founded Dawn Mountain, where she teaches regularly and where one can both begin to learn and then explore in depth the Buddhist traditions of study and contemplative practice that flourish for many centuries in the Tibetan cultural area. With that, and with no further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Philip.
Okay, is this on? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so I thought I would tell you a little bit about my involvement with this epic tradition in India. And I think most of you have probably heard of the Ramayana. It's one of the usually said to be the 2 great classical epic traditions of South Asia and Southeast Asia as well, very popular. But as you may know, the oldest version of it, the Sanskrit epic poem attributed to the poet Valmiki, is actually not that well known by contemporary audiences, and it has not been that well known through the millennia, because it's in Sanskrit, and that's a classical language that was reserved to the elite and most people had no access to. So the Ramayana has been repeatedly not translated, interestingly enough, because very rarely did poets choose to actually do a literal translation as we would think of it today, but instead retold, creatively retold. In all different parts of India. There's the famous phrase 300 Ramayanas that A.K. Ramanujan coined, but there are indeed that many literary Ramayanas in dozens of languages, and they are all different, and they all tell the story from different perspectives and expand upon it in creative ways. And one of the most famous of these is the epic that Jules mentioned. Its official name is Ramcharitmanas, which is really hard to translate because it's the Manas is the sacred Manasarovar lake in the Himalayas. So it's the sacred lake of the auspicious deeds, Charita, of Ram, the hero of the Ramayana, Rama, an incarnation of Vishnu. And it was composed in the 1570s. In North India under the reign of the Emperor Akbar, a very liberal-minded Islamic emperor, very Sufi-oriented Islamic emperor, in a period of relative peace and great cultural ferment. And so contemporary with Shakespeare and Elizabeth I. And it is a magisterial work. It's the great masterpiece of pre-modern Hindi literature in most people's estimation, and has become a Bible-like text for much of northern and central India, the subcontinent. I mean, it's used in everyday life in all kinds of contexts. You hear verses from it chanted on the radio at the beginning of the broadcast day. You encounter it being recited in temples all around. Verses are sung at marriages and all kinds of other auspicious events. It plays a very large role in Hindu, particularly, cultural life. I became fascinated with it as a young traveler in India in the 1970s on my first couple of trips there, realizing that this was a very central cultural text, and being fascinated by devotional poetry. I began studying it as a graduate student in the late 1970s at the University of Chicago, and then went to study its performance traditions. Because what I was interested in is that here is this formidable epic. It's 13,000 lines, so it's about 600-700 pages in most editions. It's a big, thick book, but it was written at a time when there was no printing. There was no means for the reproduction of books, and yet we know that within a few decades it had reached a very large audience. There is evidence for this, that people across hundreds of miles in the Gangetic Plain knew about it and were listening to it and chanting it. And so and then of course it continued to grow in impact over the centuries, and I was fascinated as to how this happened in a culture that at that point the literacy rate was probably less than 1%. I mean, it was 3% in 1888 when the British first started, the census. So I mean, it was a minuscule. So it was largely an illiterate culture, and here's this literary epic. It's a very literary text. One of the most interesting things I'll just mention quickly about it. How am I doing? Okay, there we go. All right. It has this very complex, very sort of postmodern structure. There are 4 different narrators telling the story of Ram and Sita, the classic story. And the narrators go in and out of focus. And so each narrator has a listener who is listening and is asking questions. And so it's this kind of reflexive palace of mirrors kind of text that right away kind of accepts the fact that there are multiple versions of the story and there are multiple ways of interpreting it. And it also invites listeners to become sort of the next transmitters and to continue this kind of dialogue. It is a dialogic text. So anyway, it was fascinating to me. I studied its oral performance traditions. I eventually produced a book called The Life of a Text. I shamelessly borrowed the title of this panel 25 years ago. But yeah, that was the beginning of my connection with it. I went on to write a book about the monkey hero Hanuman, who is such a key character in it. And who I learned through studying the Ramayana that actually he's in many ways more important than the hero Ram. And so that's kind of the starting point of my Hanuman book. And then after the death of one of my mentors, A.K. Ramanujan, in 1993, I started trying my hand at translating this text, which I had up till then never really thought about doing. There are 9 complete English translations. The one that I'm currently in the middle of is going to be the 10th, I think. 9 that I know of. But I never liked any of them. And yeah, and I have had the opportunity to work with this really wonderful project, the Murti Classical Library of India, which some of you may know about, which is a new enterprise being brought out by Harvard University Press with very generous endowment from an Indian software billionaire named Rohan Murthy, but a man of an extraordinary vision and taste and love of the arts and literature. And so anyway, it's coming out in these dual language editions modeled on the old Loeb Classical Library of Greek and Latin. They're low priced, they're very handsomely printed and bound, and I've had the opportunity to throw my voice in with what is to be a 7-volume translation. 2 volumes came out in January of this great epic of Tulsidas. So, is that okay? There's a minute left, but I'm happy to turn it over to Brian.
I'll take your minute.
Okay. Take it.
I might need it.
Yeah, you got a complex topic.
Thank you so much, Philip. I can't wait to read. I've begun, and I can't wait to read more. Brian's going to tell us about someone of whom until about 10 days ago, I knew only from a silly Hollywood movie. And I can't wait to hear what he has to say. So, take it away.
Okay. Can we get my lead slide up here? Sorry, I'm going to have to read this because I just came up with it last night. Okay, first of all, let me thank the organizers and sponsors of the Jaipur Literary Festival for making this wonderful event possible, and second, for inviting me to take part, to Jules for moderating, to Sujata for her work, and most importantly, to all of you for coming to listen and I hope ask questions. So what can a historian like me, an historian of the Middle Ages, say about epic at a gathering such as this? Particularly a historian who does not do translation and does not study literature per se, but rather social, economic, and cultural interactions of peoples of different faith communities. And most importantly, even if I have nothing to say, being an academic, how can I keep it to 10 minutes? Those were the questions I was asking myself yesterday afternoon as I sat at my desk thinking about what on earth I was going to talk about. And then the answer came as a bolt out of the blue. Well, actually not a bolt, a sword. A sword which, for some reason, with no warning, somehow fell from or leapt off of the top of the big roll-top desk that I write at and landed point down exactly in my keyboard, effectively killing it. Wow. This would be, under any circumstances, a surprising and somewhat mysterious turn of events, but it was all the more shocking in this case because the book I was sitting at my desk working on while I thought of my talk is A History of Islamic Spain. And the sword in question was none other than La Tizona, the firebrand, one of the two swords of the legendary warrior Rodrigo Díaz del Vivar, better known as El Cid. You all know El Cid, Charlton Heston. Wrong epic, sorry. The scourge of Muslims, the Muslims of medieval Spain, the proto-crusader, the vanquisher of the Moors, the legendary hero of the Reconquista, the champion of the church against the infidel and of the Spanish nation against its foreign invaders. And in case you don't believe me, here it is. I brought it along to show you. So there you go. And there it is. And so now, with the permission of Jules and the organizers, which I did not actually ask for, I'll pass it around. Don't worry, it's not sharp, but please give it back to me afterwards, because if not, my 8-year-old son will never forgive me. Also, don't wave it around. Colorado is a concealed carry state, so anything could happen. Today, anyone can get themselves tizona, or for that matter, a colada, which is the other sword of the Cid, and I actually have one of these too. Which I'll pass around. Here, we'll get this one. You may have deduced from their rust-free appearance and from their obvious newness, or from the printed tag on each one that reads artisanal reproduction made in Toledo, that these are not the real thing. Pretty much a dead giveaway. The real tizona, according to legend, was acquired by the Cid from, come on Cid, Abu Bakr, the Muslim king of Valencia. The Cid then gave it to the princes of Carrion on the occasion of their marriage to his daughters, Elvira and Sol. And by the late 1400s, it found itself in the possession of Álvaro de Luna, the royal constable and favorite of Juan II of Castile, the father of Isabel the Catholic, whose husband, Fernando the Catholic, gave it to a nobleman named the Marquez of Falfez, whose family kept it until 2002, when the Prime Minister of Spain, José María Aznar, known in Spain as he of the mustache, sorry, or better yet, in his natural element, here, or even better, here. Yes, that is him in a Cid costume, holding Tithana. Jose Maria Aznar had La Tizona declared an object of cultural value and orchestrated its purchase with $2 million of public funds from the present Marquis of Falthez so that it could be displayed in the Museum of Burgos, the capital of Old Castile, the Cid's native kingdom. Problem is, the sword is apparently 500 years old, not 1,000 years old. There was no king named Abu Bakr in Valencia. The princes of Carrion never existed. The names of the Cid's daughters were not Elvira and Sol. And whatever the origin of the sword that was received by the Marquis of Falthez, it was already one of several Tizonas circulating in Spain at the time. In other words, my $50 Tizona is no less authentic a Tizona than the Tizona which Jose Maria Aznar, or more properly, the taxpayers of Spain, purchased for $2 million. Now, there was indeed a real El Cid. We don't have an image of him, but we do have his signature. A rough Latin scrawl that says, Ego Ruderico, I, Rodrigo. He was a valiant warrior driven by a lust for power and girded by a sense of honor. He was cruel when he felt he needed to be, usually when money was involved, and clement when it suited his purposes. He was certainly Christian, and he did conquer Muslim Spain, or Muslim Valencia, but he spent much of his career leading Muslim armies against their Christian enemies, and his greatest victories were over fellow Christians. Songs were sung of his glory and bravery by both Muslims and Christians in Spain, even while he was still alive. And after his death, he was soon turned into a legend. But almost all of the familiar stories we know about him, his dreams of reconquering Spain, his fervent faith, the humiliation of his daughters, and the righteous revenge he took, are inventions. Tales that took shape over the 2 centuries after his death. And his image endured because some of the values he was seen to embody, nobility, bravery, and honor, have a universal quality that transcends time and culture. And so he continued to live on as a hero from the Middle Ages on to today, whether as a liberal, pragmatic hero in the imagination of Hollywood director Anthony Mann, or as an unflinching paladin of Christianity in the fantasies of the violent and repressive Spanish fascist dictator Francisco Franco. Like any hero or prophet, El Cid was malleable enough a figure to be adopted to any need, any time, and any agenda. And this brings me finally to epic. Epic, often grounded ultimately in historical figures and historical events in real places and real times in history, does not survive and does not exist independently of the imagination of its readers and listeners. It is the audience who creates epic by imagining its heroes and endowing their actions with meaning, fleshing them out with detail and providing them with a narrative arc that lends itself to telling and retelling, listening and re-listening. Epic is self-affirming in the act of origin for the teller and subsequently for the listener and reteller. It resembles in many ways scripture, another genre which is rooted in the mundanities of the historical past, but which we endow with a universality, eternality, and a moral dimension which may have been wholly foreign to the people of its own time. Epic, like scripture, as much or perhaps more than it allows us to know the past or provides a window on higher eternal truths, provides, if we examine it critically, an opportunity to better know ourselves, and provides a glimpse of our truths. Truths that, if we have the courage to admit them, are no less eternal than my Tithona, which are at bottom the products of our own imagination, and which serve only to illuminate our own values, agendas, and predispositions, and so to obscure the values, predispositions, and truths of those we conceive of as others. So I guess what I'm driving at is not that we should dispense with our epics, or our myths, or our scripture, but to treat them responsibly for what they are, to use them to inspire us to a higher good, but to resist the temptation to use them to paint the world as a place of moral absolutes, where inevitably we are right and they are wrong, where we are good and they are evil, and where in a few short steps, acts of inhumanity and violence become not only permissible, but seen as inevitable and necessary, perhaps desirable. And I say that as someone living in and observing our country today. So, thank you, and please pass the swords back.
Where's the other one? Keep these in case anyone asks me. Brian, thank you so much. That was wonderful. As I was saying, everything gets turned inside out and upside down right away, and everything you thought you knew. Well, so much for that. I'd like to ask Anne Klein to speak to us now. Anne is going to speak in part about one of the most luminous, elegant, and profound gentlemen that I've ever known anywhere. But I'll leave it to Anne to tell the story.
Thank you, Jules. And thank you, Festival and Festival Angels and organizers and Jules for conceiving this panel. And of course, Jesse, the archangel behind all of it. So it's a pleasure to be here, and what to say. It really just occurred to me 2 nights ago that I might talk about Khyentse Rinpoche and his book, which is my most recent book, where he talks about his life, and he also talks about the great completeness tradition, the Dzogchen tradition to which Jules was alluding, which in its own conception is really kind of the ultimate epic standard of human life, you might say. This is what one approaches as somebody who is looking into a path. And before I say too much about Khyentse Rinpoche, I'll just say a few words, a little bit of context. I saw him for the first time in 1971 in Darjeeling. And that was the result of my having had a few years before, when in retrospect was really a major pivot in my life. It just dawned on me, something like a sword falling on my computer, but there were actually no physical outcome of this apparition, which was that I just had to go to India. And I didn't actually know anything about India, much less did I know really that the Tibetans were in India, but I spent a little time learning about India before I went, and in the process, learned about the Tibetan tradition enough to want to study it when I was in India. And when I saw Rinpoche, I just, wow, he looks so nice. And later, Jeffrey Hopkins invited him to University of Virginia, and a few of us shared a house so we could hang out with him, really, and walk him back and forth to classes. And so this is a picture of him in 1973, by which time he had already completed, I think, 12 volumes of historiography called the Biographical Dictionary of Tibet. He had spent 10 years in Japan as the representative of Dujom Rinpoche, who was then the head of the ancient or Nyingma order of Tibetan Buddhism, and he had founded a school which he continued for the rest of his long life. He lived until 90. He passed away in 2009. So I didn't know then, but that was the beginning of a 35-plus year relationship when I saw him that moment on the road. And he was devoted to the tradition of Dzogchen, the great completeness, and particularly to several lineages, actually, but perhaps the most widespread lineage of Dzogchen in Tibet, known as the Longchen Nyingtik, heart essence of the vast expanse. And I'll be referring to Longchenpa and Jigme Lingpa, so I just put their names up there so you could see them. And the Longchen Nyingtik, the heart essence of the vast expanse, in the view of Longchenpa, and he was really the one to systematize this most brilliantly and poetically and beautifully and significantly for the culture down to this day, there was, he understood everything to be included in the vast expanse. And that vast expanse was understood to be a complete conflation of wisdom and energy. And that energy of wisdom is understood to be compassion, compassionate energy. So that in his view, we could sum it up by saying something like reality, the way things really are. Reality is wisdom compassionately loving itself, which suggests that kindness, against all obvious perceptions, kindness is actually implicitly embedded in everything because reality is everywhere. Longchenpa said that wisdom is everywhere. And in a certain way, we can take this back to India, to 2nd century Nagarjuna, the great hero of India, of Buddhist Madhyamaka middle way, and in his praise of the Dharmadhatu could be translated as reality realm or womb or matrix or stainless space or basic space. You get the idea. It's big and everything comes forth from it. It's this creative, loving organ, really, which includes everything. And this, Nagarjuna said, is in everyone. Everyone. And not just humans. Never mind just bad humans, Or but, you know, bugs, fish was in the dinosaurs. So this is a kind of starting point, which later with Sangha, Maitreya, and then Longchenpa quotes these texts. So we know there's a direct connection, there's kind of a straight shot in a certain way from 2nd century Nagarjuna through a lot of iterations to 14th century Longchenpa. And this is the arc that Kitsen Rinpoche was trying to share with his students, and very, very kindly with us, his Western students as well. And in 1996, he gave a week-long retreat, actually in California, on the text that he had written on Dzogchen, which he calls My Teacher's Essential Guidance on Dzogchen. And that is the text translated here, and in these 7 days, he gave very generous commentary on it. And I want to read you a few things that he said and tell you one or two more things that he did. I want to tell you that the very first sentence of this commentary, which if you remember nothing else, I think is quite compelling. The life we have right now is precious beyond measure. Whatever you do, please take care of it well. Take care of it and use it well. And really, the whole epic of Dzogchen, or perhaps of any spiritual path, of any good-hearted path, is to explore what exactly one does with a life that is so precious, and what does it mean to use it well. And that is perhaps at the root of the penetrating debate we're having in this country also. If everyone's life is precious, then what? Can one be in tune with reality without actually acknowledging that? These questions also arise. Rinpoche's own life was full of challenges. He had to leave Tibet in a hurry in his early 30s. He was fully trained as a Lama by that time. He was actually in retreat, in a dark retreat, and the police came and he just had to leave. And he left a wife and a 3-year-old daughter, and he never saw his wife again. And the 3-year-old daughter in 1981 came with his grandson, now known as Tulku Kanjur Tulku Jigme, who has now taken over his school and who Rinpoche raised. Speaking of this, how am I doing? Where am I?
About 2.5 minutes, but
Ooh.
not that strict. Take a little more time.
I wanted to read you. I'll just read you one expression from reality itself, quoted in Kitsen Sambo's book, a verse from the Tantra known as the magic creator of everything. Hear me! I am the uncontrived heart of space. Beyond overrating or underplaying, past, present, and future Buddhas arise from me. And so I am definitively known as Mother of the Majesties. And this same majestic mother is in everyone. And what happens when you realize this, and what does that feel like? Kitsen Samba quotes our friend Longchenpa and says, well, then when you look at things, you understand that everything lacks existence is true. They seem laced with holes, evanescent, fluctuating, pristinely pure, like bits of light jingling together. And you are purified into a great release from any holding to anything. And if I may, I'll just read one bit about an episode from his life and close with one more moment of contact with him. One of his teachers was Lama Gompo, a lifetime yogic recluse. He was a great yogi staying in hermitages. And he wanted to go on pilgrimage to Samye, the first monastery of Tibet. His knees were bad, and so he asked me, Kitsen Sambo, to accompany him. We traveled together, taking the old Tibetan-style boat, a leather coracle, down the Tongbo River to Samye. At Samye, Gompa Rinpoche offered all his possessions and announced he was going to the Cave of White Light, where many mysterious things had happened already in the past. And when we arrived there, we heard this fantastic music, and we couldn't understand how the 3 hermits staying there could make such loud music. And they were also amazed, these 3 hermits, because they thought the music was coming from us. In fact, Kizensama writes, this was probably a sign that Gompo Rinpoche was going to die in this place. Lama Gompo said, if you don't have anything to ask, everybody leave. Close up this place. Nobody come in here for 7 days. When we left him in the cave, Lama Gompo, who was a large person, was wearing heavy clothes because of the cold. His main attendant became uneasy, and so, after 6 days, he decided to look into the cave. He saw only clothing inside, no body. The attendant started to gather the clothing, but then the Lama appeared, yet much smaller than he was when we last saw him, with a tremendous brilliance of light and emitting rainbows. Gompo Rinpoche had explained before going into this final retreat that he would reduce the size of his body and turn it into a rainbow body, but that if this were successful, if this were not successful, we were to cremate his body. Everyone began arguing. Lama Gompo's students felt that the proper thing to do was to obey Lama Gompo's wishes and cremate his remains. So we did this. And many absolutely extraordinary things occurred. Rainbows and relics of different kinds appeared in the ashes. We divided the relics and sent half to the monastery of Dodrupchen. The remainder we divided to place in 2 or 3 stupas, reliquaries. Just a note on the thread of kindness that runs through from what reality is understood to be toward even what the kind intention here might be. A moment at 2 o'clock in the morning after Rinpoche, then about 85, his last visit to this country, was in his room. His wife assured me that he was still awake. When I said I needed something from the room, she said, don't, just go get it. And so I walked in, and he sat up. Obviously, he had been lying down and asleep. He just sat up, and immediately he said, can I help you? He was always like that. So thank you.
Many thanks to each of you. They're quite remarkable stories. I want to ask you to, give you the opportunity to ask questions of one another. These disparate topics, I have to think, they intrigue all of us, and maybe there's some things that you'd like to ask of one another, and then we'll offer some opportunity to people attending the session to do so. I just want to observe one thing, which is, it may be just because storytelling is the thing I've fallen in love with from a very young age, and so I'm perhaps biased in a certain direction, but I'm just stunned by the way in which the imagination weaves through all these things. And Brian was talking about it a little bit. And the way in which somebody lives a life, or is thought to have lived a life, and even while they're living it, the life is being reimagined by everyone else. And so that pretty soon the life that's been imagined has replaced the life that's been lived. And it gets passed on down to many generations that way. And then also, the way in which the writers themselves become involved in the imagination of their lives and the imagination of their subjects, and being completely absorbed into what they're writing about and the life they're dreaming of. And, the boundaries between what seems to be, quote unquote, actually happening and what's being thought to have happened and how it's imagined by others as it's given to them later, these kinds of boundaries are being totally erased. So I don't know whether that's of any interest to any of the 3 of you, but please, Brian?
I wonder if that's the the curse of the prophet, to be imagined during one's own life.
Right, for sure.
But everyone is imagined in their own life, even if they're not famous, don't you think? We're always projecting and
The stakes are lower.
creating. Perhaps.
The stakes are low.
When does the seed come to be imagined as a? When does the seed come to be imagined as an anti-Islamic warrior? I'm curious about that.
Really, probably about 100 or 150 years after his death. But really, the anti-Islamic thing, I think, is really a secondary thing. What it becomes is a story about Spanish machismo, really, and honor. And so the whole Muslim-Christian thing is kind of really secondary. And I think that finally it really emerges probably, like I think everything does, not until the sort of mid-19th century when the sort of national identities start coalescing and these myths are reimagined. And that's when this whole notion of the Reconquista became really important, because it provided a retroactive justification for the unification of Spain, something that had never previously been politically unified. So it's actually quite late, and it's full of ironies. Francisco Franco, who characterized his uprising, which resulted in the Spanish Civil War and 40 years of Spanish dictatorship, imagined himself as a crusader. His enemy was the Reds, but he was a crusader for the church, and ironically, he used Muslim troops in Spain. So,
Yes, I was appalled to learn in Avila that he kept Teresa's forefinger at his bedside. He had this relic of Saint Teresa. Ugh. Yeah, devout guy.
there you go.
Yeah.
He wasn't so good at turning the other cheek, but
Yeah. The poet of the Tulsidas, the poet of the Ramcharitmanas, Tulsidas, is a fascinating figure, and I'm engaged in this kind of dialogue with him all the time, almost every day when I'm working on my translation. And he's interesting in that he presents himself in this very self-effacing way. He's merely repeating what he learned from his gurus. He's merely repeating the eternal Ramayana, in this sense of a kind of what by that time was come to be seen as almost a kind of revealed tradition. But in fact, he has very definite opinions. And he puts himself, he's one of the four narrators. And he's constantly interjecting little asides and little comments in his own voice, and putting himself, into the narrative in effect. And he's a charming, multi-sided, somewhat ornery poet scholar, and reimagining the Ramayana in his own terms, and very consciously crafting there in about 1574 a text that he wants to be a new scripture. And he's not doing it in Sanskrit. He's doing it in what he calls the village language, the language of rustics. And he's putting it into the mouths of common people and making it potentially transmittable by them and to them. And that's a very radical thing. You think of the Reformation in Europe as a kind of parallel instance. But he's very conscious of the fact that because he's writing on such a big scale and because he's creating this very masterful work with a very complex and fascinating structure, he is going to create a masterpiece that is going to take on the authority of a scriptural text, a Sanskrit text. And that's a fascinating thing about it for me, and that really comes in. The first volume of my translation is largely his own prologue to the epic, in which he kind of frames all of this. And I find that glimpse of a personality very fascinating.
Yeah, did you think he intended that himself? Did he imagine himself becoming that?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, right.
I personally, as others might dispute with me, but I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, we're swirling in a hall of imaginative mirrors at this point, as Tulsidas is imagining the life of Ram, the stories of Ram from many different points of view. And now you, of course, in your role as a translator, imagining him and his work.
True.
And someday, not too long in the future, someone will be looking back at you as the translator, and you're being woven into the mosaic of the whole story, and it goes on that way.
Could be.
Yeah.
And that actually seems important to recognize. I'm thinking of a powerful line in Holly Daly's forthcoming book, where she recognizes that she herself is entering the biography which she is revealing in her book, Biography and Autobiography. And,
Holly, take a bow.
And, And, as you say, we're all doing something. And, wouldn't it have been better if Franco had been honest about the manipulations that he was making? So maybe it's worth our thinking about.
Yeah.
I wonder if you think about that.
The extent that we're conscious of those manipulations.
Right,
Much of the time
exactly.
we're so caught up in our own agendas that
Exactly. It's really a call to look in the mirror. And I think we don't because we're so worried usually about what we're doing that we don't really step back. I think that's why it was such a powerful line for me to read. Like, oh, what am I? Here I am telling this story. This is what people are going to think was true about, the Ramayana, El Cid, this person who is important to me. It's not nothing, And you can't help but change it, but at least you could be honest or recognize that you might not be able to be honest, even that.
That opening line that you read about valuing this life reminded me of a verse from Tulsidas. Bade bhagya manusya tanupayi suradura labha sabha grantan higayi. It's a great good fortune to obtain a human birth, a human life.
Is that where we got
It's difficult even for the gods. So all the scriptures declare.
It was a good Buddhist.
Well, there's a deep humanism in it
Yeah.
that affirms the importance of individual human life.
And in the Vajrayana tradition that Kesen Sambo is teaching, as we know, as you start to listen to Buddhist teachers tell you what the world is for real, and it's an active imagination from the beginning in that they're telling you something that you can't see with your eyes or hear with your ears. You have to imagine the prison that you're bound in and imagine what the release from the prison might look like. And the further one goes into the exposition of secret mantra and tantric teachings of all sorts, imagining a rather different world to the point that the sacred world sort of devoured the conventional world, devoured the absorbed us into it and replaced it. And, in the kinds of practices and teachings that Keten Sambo is involved in, it becomes such a literal matter. The story you tell at the end of his teacher being physically absorbed into his imagination of contemplation of some other reality altogether is, makes your head spin.
Or dissolve.
Or dissolve, whichever it is.
Well, as you know, of course, the man, yes and no, I guess, because there is something that is occurring. There is the way it is, whatever it is that we may not exactly be able to access. And the only way we could begin to access it is through the imagination. And the imagination also will here involve, as you know, the body. And so I feel it's not, if we have to understand, and Jigme Lingpa says that the essence of speech is energy, is prana, is lung. And that, of course, is something felt in the body. So it's kind of a full-bodied disavowal of the ordinary sense of embodiment, dramatically illustrated in a moment like this, perhaps.
Brian, both in what I was reading in your book and some of the things you touched on today, you're tiptoeing gracefully around some of the resonance between what happened so long ago and the monstrous situations in which we find ourselves now. But I wonder if I could tease you out a little bit. I mean, if there's anything you'd care to say a little bit more straightforwardly. If not, I understand. But, about when you look back at that time and look at our own time, what kind of reflections you see?
Well, what I could say is that in my experience as a historian, the fundamental realities of being a person in society don't seem to change that much. And I think it's often, in many ways, it's the sort of the window dressing that changes, the props. But, my own sense is that because of the constraints of our bodies and the way we perceive of the world, that the basic set of hopes, dreams, ambitions, and fears haven't probably really changed since, the Paleolithic. So this is why history is useful. Otherwise, it would be trivia.
We should really mention the title of Brian's most recent book, which is Muslims in...
The Muslims of Medieval Latin Christendom.
Yeah, which is a extraordinarily comprehensive study. And in what little I've been able to read of it, I see echoes of the tension around Hindu-Muslim relations in India today. And I'm very conscious of this because I'm translating a poem that is now regarded as a Hindu sacred scripture and is very much revered by people who I would call the Hindu right. And I'm sometimes a little scared of them myself. I mean, in terms of my own, I wasn't sure at all what kind of reaction these first two volumes were going to get in India. So far, let's touch wood somewhere here, it's been pretty good. But I was very pleased at the Jaipur Literature Festival in January in Jaipur when one of my co-panelists there, Dr. Harish Trivedi, who is a great scholar of Hindi literature, started talking about Tulsidas and read this wonderful poem of Tulsidas in which he talks about when he was a homeless boy. He had a very difficult childhood, and he would sleep in mosques at night for safety and took shelter in mosques. And we know that he had Muslim friends in his circle. And so, it was a very different world from this kind of polarized environment that's been created, particularly since 1947 and particularly since the rise of right-wing religious parties in the late 1980s in India.
Thank you. So before opening up for questions from all of you, I just want to mention the book of Brian's that I've been reading for the past couple of weeks called Infidel Kings and Unholy Warriors, in which he tells the sort of dizzying story of these complex relationships and turned inside out. Particular. No sword.
I don't have a thing about swords. Okay? Really.
But Brian is a wonderful writer and storyteller, and the story itself is just utterly absorbing. So I urge all of you to run to the bookstore and buy a copy of it and learn a great deal. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to invite questions from all of you for our authors.
Could you say a few words about the Sita? Sorry. Could you say a few words about the? Could you say a few words about the Sita in Tulsidas' work versus Valmiki's work?
Sure. She's not. Well, gosh, this is touchy. Sita to Tulsidas. Let's put the most positive spin on it we can here. Sita to Tulsidas is the supreme feminine Shakti. She is the ultimate goddess. She is Ram's feminine aspect. She is the Jagajanani, the mother of creation. And so he is very devoted to her. And there are some beautiful evocations of that devotion in the epic. As a literary character, I would have to say she is almost absent. She's not very much there, and she doesn't have the kind of psychological complexity that Valmiki's Sita has. And very strikingly, there is almost no physical description of her in Tulsidas. Rama is repeatedly described in these very elaborate, what we call in Hindi, foot to crown of head descriptions, his beauty. Of Sita, there's nothing like that. And her status was so exalted by that time that, as you might know, Tulsidas' Sita is never actually kidnapped by Ravana. Only her shadow, only this kind of fake Sita that she creates temporarily is actually spirited away and then has to be rescued by Rama. The real Sita is concealed. She becomes invisible. That's how it is.
it's just for Anne. I was curious when you were reading that book and you were listing kind of previous titles. Does each Rinpoche or do some of them sort of carry on the tradition of writing their own epic, kind of, or based on the other epics? I mean, I was getting a weird
You mean
impression.
the 14th century Longchenpa and 18th century?
Yeah,
do you
so
mean
that they're rewriting that
Sorry,
and reimagining it.
well, in a large sense, I think that's true. Longchenpa was synthesizing a lot of material built up in Tibet from 9th, 10th, especially 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, but some of it goes back to India. So a lot of people were writing about what they thought reality was and within this particular tradition. And one is I think Jules, it's always a dialogue. One is always writing a text in these contexts in dialogue with what has an awareness of what has been written before. So in that sense, it's a living thing being brought forward and altering. And again, one doesn't say, I'm altering. Rinpoche, represents himself as offering the distillation of what he has heard from his teachers, as is traditional to do, and at the same time putting his own creative, he has selected quotes, he has selected emphasis, and he has selected how much detail to go into in print, which actually was somewhat astonishing, given what he was talking about and the traditional way of holding some of this information. Does that speak to
There's a
you?
gentleman here and then a lady up there, and that probably will be it.
My question's for Phil. I'm wondering, how do you retell the epic, since you work with it so much and you're in this process of translating the 7 volumes or 5 more from now? How is it that you can retell this epic based in your just personal life and your just from working with it so much? How do you retell it in your life outside of the text?
Okay. I teach, I'm a university teacher, so I teach about it a lot. And when I teach about it, I don't teach about a single text. I teach about this multiform storytelling tradition, which has been so productive of all kinds of debate and thinking about culture on the subcontinent. So I don't know, are you asking about my inner life?
How does it go into
Let's talk privately. Okay. Of course it does, and people in India often ask me that question, actually. So I'd be happy to talk to you about it, but yeah, not now.
Okay. Last question, I think, woman up.
As briefly as you can, when does a story become an epic?
Maybe.
When does a story become an epic? I guess when it encapsulates or embodies what people perceive of as being central or essential to one of their identities, I guess. It's a clumsy way of pulling it together, but I think it suggests that it's a process that is dependent not so much on the writer, but on the audience, right? Who elevated to the status of an epic by retelling it and listening to it.
And if I could add to that, there is a very interesting phenomenon in many languages of an epic appearing at the moment when a kind of a vernacular is becoming, achieving a kind of status, and for whatever socio-political, cultural reasons. And my teacher Ramanujan used to like, there's this famous saying, a language is a dialect with an army. And he used to say, a language is a dialect with an army and an epic poet. Yeah.
The circumstances around which the
Is that, are we formally?
I think maybe one more.
Time for one more? Is this on? I'm not sure if I can phrase this properly, but what Philip was just saying about a language, it's so cultural specific. These epics are, for the most part, so culturally specific and often then become politically important in terms of there's creating enemies and who are the good and who are the enemy. There's the center and then there's the outside. And yet, obviously, this isn't working for our times. It didn't work in the Middle Ages. It didn't work for thousands of years in India with the Muslim, incursions. Are there any epics that, Brian, are your books that revisit the history of the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians living, I'm told, for a period of time in harmony in Spain? I don't know if that's so. But are there epics that are more inclusive or that will fit this need, that don't create enemy and other? Does that exist?
In the mystical traditions of all three, but they don't teach that in church. Sorry.
Excuse me?
In narrative literature, too, they exist. I think that what happens, though, is they don't tend to get elevated to the status of epic because, epic, like scripture, depends on simple truths. And those sort of complexities are never simple. What's interesting, I find, is that sometimes epic is so attractive that it can be attractive even to the people that are ostensibly villainized. Mm-hmm. Much as one can go to the Middle East and see, American movies where Americans are the good guys and Muslims are the bad guys. Or a friend of mine, David Wax in Oregon, a short time ago, discovered a text which was a crusade romance, but it was written in Arabic for the consumption of and written by Muslims living under Christian rule in Spain. So these Muslims who are living under Christian rule are like reading this crusade epic going, yeah, go Crusaders, because it's a great story, all right? So these things play out on many levels.
Is it quick? It's...
Yeah, I'm from Spain, and so I just wanted to share with you how for us of my generation, the way an epic is explained by your teachers, how quickly it changed, the transformation it underwent. In the late 70s, even right after Franco died, and even in the 80s, our teachers used to talk about El Cid and the Reconquista in such an old-fashioned way that it was like the monolithic Spain and going and it was like they were heroes and all of that. And suddenly you could feel that the young professors in the 80s, they were Marxists or progressives because they were allowed to speak up. They were telling you the same story. So I had in my second year at high school and third year, the same story was told to me in a completely different way. And that happened in the early 80s because, you could have, so the way they told you the epics and the Cid and the whole narrative completely changed within a few years. And if you come to think of it, the way we look now at Islam and inhabiting with Islamic communities, just come to think of it, I was in Chicago and America when 11 September happened, so I knew what happened afterwards. But I was also in Spain when our 11M in 2004 happened, which was supposed to be, the bombs on the trains and kind of the message of reconquering Al-Andalus, and nothing happened there. I mean, nothing happened in the sense that I think the Islamic communities didn't feel any kind of rage or any kind of tension at all in Spain after what we underwent, and we had suffered it was a huge blow. So I think that's something to think about, how we nowadays think about immigration, and maybe you should interview Islamic communities there, and maybe France and Germany, and see the difference. So it's quite interesting. What the transformation that Spain has gone through in the last 30, 40 years is just, it's radical, it's amazing.
May it hold.
Yeah. So I think we have to stop here. I'd like to thank our three authors for inviting us into something about which we probably didn't know very much before, and I look forward to learning from all of them. And many thanks to all of you for coming to the session. I hope we'll be able to get together again and again to talk about these things and learn much more about them.